This is a comparison between the Canon R1 and the Canon R5 Mark II. These are Canon's flagship cameras, meaning they have the best of the best when it comes to their features. I tested these cameras head-to-head on a ton of features which I'll list out here, and everything will be timestamped for your convenience. I'll be covering mainly the video features since I am a filmmaker, but I'll cover some of the photo features as well since these are both hybrid cameras. And at the very end, I'll share my final verdict on the strengths and weaknesses of these cameras and who I think should pick up which camera. Hi there, my name is Bruno Pozo. I'm a full-time commercial filmmaker living here in Bend, Oregon. I make weekly videos on filmmaking gear, technique, and how to make money with your camera. If any of that interests you, hit that like and subscribe. Now let's hop into the comparison. Just to make this a little more fun, I'll be giving a point to whichever camera wins on each of these tests. And at the end, I'll share the aggregate score of each camera and see if that actually ultimately contributes to the final decision. And to start this comparison off, let's cover the prices of these cameras because that's where they really differ the most. The Canon R1 is considered Canon's top mirrorless camera, and it boasts a price tag of $6,300 USD just for the body alone. While the Canon R5 Mark II, which comes second in the lineup of Canon's mirrorless cameras, actually costs $4,300 USD just for the body alone. So right off of the bat, there's a $2,000 difference between these cameras. So all of the differences that I'll be covering in this video should be used in the context of that $2,000 gap between them. Because at the end of the day, are the extra benefits of the Canon R1 worth the extra $2,000? Well, we'll find out. Now let's move on to the sensor size and megapixels of these cameras. Luckily, both of these cameras are full frame cameras, so they share the exact same sensor size. Although the Canon R1 is supposed to have a stacked CMOS sensor that reads out a lot faster, especially because it is 24 megapixels. And the Canon R5 Mark II is also a stacked sensor, but it has a higher resolution with 45 megapixels. In practice, this means that the sensor resolution of the Canon R1 is 6,000 by 4,000-ish, while the Canon R5 Mark II's 45 megapixel resolution is roughly 8,000 by 4,500. Now, this is going to play a bigger role when we start talking about image quality and low light performance. So let's start with the video formats you can record in these cameras. The Canon R1 allows you to record from 1080p all the way up to 6K RAW. And in 4K, you have options from 24 frames per second all the way to 120 frames per second. You also get the addition of C-Log2 finally in a mirrorless camera from Canon. Now on the Canon R5 Mark II, because of its sensor resolution, you actually have access of 1080p all the way up to 8K RAW video. And in 4K, you can also record from 24 frames per second all the way to 120 frames per second. And the Canon R5 Mark II also comes with C-Log2 as well. The only real difference between these two cameras when it comes to their video recording formats is the raw video resolution and 4K 60. On the Canon R1, you can record 4K 60 oversampled from the 6K sensor, which results in a much cleaner and sharper 4K 60 video. While the Canon R5 Mark II currently does not oversample the 4K 60 video from the 8K sensor, which results in a much softer 4K 60 with some aliasing and some weird artifacts if you shoot screens or any sort of fine detail. So this one's sort of tough to give a point to because I do think 4K 60 being sharp is a really strong pro for the Canon R1. But if you don't really care about that and you're going to shoot in those raw video formats that the Canon R5 Mark II has, which by the way, it can shoot raw in 4K and 8K, then I do think that the R5 Mark II leads in this, but it really is going to depend. But for now, I'm actually going to give the point to the Canon R5 Mark II. But let's dive deeper into the 4K video performance of these cameras. As I just mentioned, the Canon R1 can record from 4K 24 to 4K 60 oversampled from that 6K sensor. But if you do 4K 120, it's not going to be oversampled. While the Canon R5 Mark II, it can record 4K 24 to 30 oversampled, but if you go to 4K 60 and 120, it's going to be line skipped. And as you can see in these head-to-head comparisons, in 4K 24 to 30, they both look really sharp and clean in the oversampled mode. But once you get into 4K 60, the Canon R1 pulls ahead with much sharper 4K 60 video performance. But it seems to level out once you hit 4K 120 because both of them, since they're not oversampling, it looks a little bit softer. And if anything, I think maybe the Canon R5 Mark II looks sharper, but it's very negligible. So in this case, I'm actually going to give the point to the Canon R1 for its 4K video performance. Now let's talk about the rolling shutter of these cameras. I did some tests here just outside, quickly whip panning, and in the Canon R1, even though it has a stack sensor and it's supposed to have amazing readout that's supposed to prevent rolling shutter, at least in photos, it doesn't seem to have that ability in video. I tried using both the oversampled 4K video and the raw video, and I saw no noticeable difference in the rolling shutter effect. And as you can see here, it's pretty minimal, but it still exists. And interestingly enough, when I shot in the Canon R5 Mark II using the exact same test, there really is no noticeable performance difference in any recording format. And as you can see, there might be slightly more rolling shutter on the Canon R5 Mark II, but in practice, this is really negligible. But because I am able to notice a difference, the point's going to the Canon R1. But what about the image stabilization performance of these cameras? Well, they both have the same exact 5-axis IBIS technology in bottage image stabilization, and in practice, there really isn't much of a difference between the cameras. Here are some handheld shots on 24mm on the R1 and the R5 II, and as you can see, they're both really minimal. But if you go on the wider end, say 15mm on either of these cameras, unfortunately, they both still have that Canon wobble in the corners of the frame. So if you're intending to do vlogging handheld, or you're gonna do a lot of handheld wide angle work, you are gonna unfortunately run into that wobbling effect. But where I think the IBIS really shines on both of these cameras is when you go past 30-ish millimeters, the corner wobble disappears and the center of the frame stabilization is really good. As you can see in this 105mm handheld shot I did, there's very minimal shake. But if I were to do that without IBIS or lens image stabilization, it would practically be unusable. So the fact that these cameras have great enough IBIS in those longer telephoto ranges, I think is a great strength of these cameras. But none of them is better than the other, so this one is also going to be a tie. A big difference between these cameras though is their low light performance. I think this is where the sensor technology on the Canon R1 really shines. The noise pattern is overall much cleaner on the Canon R1, but what I think makes it stand out is its sort of fake triple base ISO. The reason I say fake is because Canon doesn't really market this camera as having a triple base ISO, but through running my own tests, I did find that in C-Log2, you have your base ISO of 800, but then when you jump to 1600, it cleans up. And then finally, when you jump to 12,800, it cleans up again. And in fact, in these shots I'm showing you here, these were all done in 12,800, and you can see how clean and usable the footage really is. This is great news for those shooters who don't always have control of the lighting in their situation, like event or documentary work. And so that's a huge win of getting the Canon R1. But how's the Canon R5 Mark II perform? Through my test again, there does seem to be some sort of faux double base ISO in the Canon R5 Mark II. In C-Log2, you have your base ISO of 800, but when you go to 4000 ISO, it cleans up again. But if you continue to raise the ISO, the image never cleans up again, and so you're just introducing more noise as you go higher. And in practice, this really shows, especially once you pass the 4000 ISO, even shots in 6400 or 8000 get really noisy really quick on this camera. So the points going to the Canon R1 for low light performance. On that note, let's talk about the dynamic range of these cameras. Since these cameras both have access to C-Log 2, which should provide 16 stops of dynamic range, I didn't expect there to be much of a difference here. But I ran some dynamic range tests where I exposed an image neutrally where it should be, and then I would under and overexpose by a stop, going up to 4 stops overexposed and 4 stops underexposed. And then simply I would correct the image to look back like it did at neutral exposure. And when I did these tests on both these cameras, they literally performed exactly the same. You can go about 2 stops with underexposing the camera and you can still recover the data pretty cleanly. But once you hit 3 stops and 4 stops, there's a big color shift and a lot more noise introduced into the image. But you can go up to 3 stops overexposed and still recover a lot of that data and make it look really nice. But once you hit 4 stops, a lot of the data becomes unrecoverable and the image really falls apart. So on this test, they both win, so it's a tie. But what about these cameras when it comes to overheating? The Canon R1 actually comes built with some sort of fan internally because I have heard it turn on. It is very quiet. It's not going to pick up if you have an on-camera microphone, but it does seem to have some sort of internal work that's supposed to help with heat control. While the Canon R5 Mark II also has an upgraded design meant to help with heat dissipation, I still think getting the cooling fan grip is important for the Canon R5 Mark II, and you'll see why based off of these tests. So starting with the Canon R1, I actually recorded in 4K 60 fine mode, which is oversampling from the 6K sensor, just to attract as much heat to the sensor as possible. But even in this mode, I was able to record for an hour and 40, almost 50 minutes before the camera overheated. But when I shot on the Canon R5 Mark II in 4K fine 30 frames per second, it actually only took about 47 minutes to overheat. Now, you can greatly improve the performance of the Canon R5 Mark II with the cooling fan battery grip. And when I set that to medium, I was actually able to record in 4K 30 fine mode for just about an hour and 30 minutes. But as you can clearly see, even with the cooling fan grip, the Canon R1 just outperforms the Canon R5 Mark II in this test, so the points going to the R1. All right, now let's get into some of those photo specs, starting with the burst modes of these cameras. Both of these cameras have a mechanical and an electronic shutter. And if you decide to shoot in the electronic shutter mode, you actually can shoot much faster in the burst rate. So the max burst rate on the Canon R1 using the electronic shutter is 40 frames per second. While the Canon R5 Mark II, their fastest burst mode in the electronic shutter mode is 30 frames per second. Not a huge difference, but if fast action is important to you, then the Canon R1 clearly wins in this test. On that note, let's compare the top shutter speed on these cameras. When shooting with the mechanical shutter, both the R1 and the R5 Mark II have a top speed of 1/8,000th of a second. But if you do shoot with the electronic shutter, the R1 pulls ahead with its top speed of 1/64,000th of a second, while the Canon R5 Mark II with the electronic shutter has a top speed of 1/32,000th of a second. So the points going to the Canon R1. What about the autofocus performance of these cameras? Technically, both of these cameras share the same dual pixel AF technology. The only difference really here is that the Canon R1 has this new addition of cross-type AF, which is supposed to allow the camera to be smart enough to look past certain objects that are obstructing you and the intended subject. So think of objects like fences or branches. So this is why the Canon R1 is technically more targeted towards sports, wildlife, and photojournalist work. But in practice, I really don't notice a difference between these cameras. They both performed extremely well. They tracked their subjects. They both have really fast autofocus performance, as you can see in my yard test running towards these cameras. But if you do want that extra reliability, then technically the Canon R1 is better, so the points going to the R1. So what is the difference between the build quality of these cameras? Here's what's the same. They're both weather sealed. They're both made with some alloy chassis that's supposed to be lightweight and heat resistant. And they both share a lot of the same ports, buttons, and dials. But there are still some really big differences. For starters, the R1 is significantly bigger than the Canon R5 Mark II because of the way the grip is built into the body. So the vertical grip is built into the R1, which allows you to control the shutter and take photos and adjust the shutter speed really quickly. So it is really comfortable to use when you decide to shoot in portrait mode for photos or videos. The Canon R1 also has a textured design along the body, which makes it really comfortable and easy to grip too. And then the R1 also has a ton of extra buttons all around the camera, which are also highly customizable. So you can really custom the experience of using the R1 to your personal preference. You can still customize buttons and dials on the Canon R5 Mark II. It's just that you don't have quite as many buttons or dials to customize. So the points going to the Canon R1. On that note, what is the ergonomics of these cameras? Well, because the Canon R1 is much bigger, it definitely feels a lot comfortable in my hands. That might vary based on your hand size, but because of the textured grip and the vertical grip that's built in, the Canon R1 is super intuitive and a joy to use. Now, the Canon R5 Mark II is smaller and more compact, which I think is also a huge benefit in its own right. It also is a very classic design, especially if you've already come from like the R6 or the R5 Mark I, then you'll be very at home with the Canon R5 Mark II. Whereas if you're coming from those cameras into the R1, you're gonna have to get used to all the new buttons, the grip style, and of course its size. But based off of my personal experience using both of these cameras, the point's gonna go to the R1 for better ergonomic design. Now, what about the size and weight of these cameras? The Canon R1, obviously a much bigger camera, and it weighs about a pound more at 2.5 pounds, while the Canon R5 Mark II weighs 1.5 pounds. So if weight and size is an important factor to you and you want something smaller, the point would go to the R5 II. But if you like having a bigger, more rugged body and the extra weight actually helps you when you're shooting, then I think the point would go to the R1. So because it's sort of a give and take in this scenario, I'm going to make this a tie. One of the most surprising differences between these cameras is actually in the viewfinder. Now, they both share a 1/2-inch viewfinder, but their resolutions and their technology are different. On the Canon R1, the resolution of the viewfinder is 9.44 million dots. And in practice, when I was looking through the viewfinder, it almost looked like I was just using my real eye because of how lifelike it looked. It was kind of scary, and I thought that Canon's marketing around the best EVF in the market was sort of BS in this regard, but having actually experienced it, I can firsthand experience say that it is not BS. The viewfinder on the R1 truly is a pleasure to use. That's not to say that the R5 Mark II's viewfinder is bad by any chance. The viewfinder on the Canon R5 Mark II has a resolution of 5.76 million dots. Now, I don't think the viewfinder is gonna make it or break it for someone, but the point's still going to the Canon R1. Now, while the viewfinder might be different, the LCD screen is another story. Both the Canon R1 and the Canon R5 Mark II share the exact same LCD screen, which in this case is 3.2 inches in size and a resolution of 2.1 million dots. So it seems Canon only invested in improving the EVF on the Canon R1, so on this test, there's going to be a tie. Now, an important part of shooting with any camera is its memory cards. So what do these cameras take? The Canon R1 takes 2 CF Express Type B cards, while the Canon R5 Mark II takes 1 CF Express Type B card and 1 UHS-2 SD card. Personally, I think having 2 matching cards is better than having one or the other, especially because it allows you to keep the same performance on both slots. I think this is why the Canon R1 can shoot faster in photos and record longer in video. But of course, on the R5 Mark II, you can still record high-resolution, high-quality videos to the CF Express card and the SD card, but you're going to have to invest in an SD card that's V90, which is the fastest type of SD card, which is also the most expensive. But if you have a CF Express Type B card, you can get faster read and write speeds and much larger storage for a lot more affordable price than an SD card V90. So the points going to the Canon R1. So what ports do these cameras have? Surprisingly, they share a lot of them with one major difference. Let's start with the Canon R1. The Canon R1 has an electric hot shoe. It has full HDMI port, mic jack, a headphone jack, a USB-C port, the Canon remote port, and a built-in Ethernet port, which is great if you do a lot of tethering in your photo work. But what about the Canon R5 Mark II? Well, it shares the same electric hot shoe. It also has a full HDMI port, the microphone jack, the headphone jack, the USB-C port, and the Canon remote control port. So if you want to have an Ethernet port on the Canon R5 Mark II, you're going to have to cough up some extra money to buy the additional grip. But it's not necessarily required, nor do you need to have that Ethernet grip, but I'm still going to give the point to the Canon R1. What about the battery life of these cameras? Well, the Canon R1 actually comes with Canon's LPE19 battery, which is this huge battery I had never seen before, but apparently has been standard since their 1DX series. But because the battery is so large, you know it has a large capacity. And in practice, I actually really love the battery life of the Canon R1. I was able to essentially shoot all day, 8-hour shoots, photo and video work on just one single charge. That's definitely not happening when I shoot on the Canon R5 Mark II, especially with their LPE6P batteries. This is partially why I decided to get the cooling fan grip, is because now I get 2 batteries on my Canon R5 Mark II, which makes the battery life that much better. But for that luxury, I did have to cough up $400 extra and $70 for each extra battery. So in this case, I bought 3 extra spares so I can always have 2 in the camera and 2 as backup. But if you are going the R1 route and getting the LPE19P batteries, then you're going to be actually paying up to $230 for the luxury of having a backup battery. But just based off the battery that comes with the camera, then the Canon R1 wins in this test. Now let's cover the audio performance of these cameras. Luckily, this one's easy. They both share the exact same audio settings and audio performance. They finally added 4-channel audio recording in 24-bit. Of course, you can still record in 16-bit stereo as well, but I like having the 4-channel option. 1, because 24-bit allows for better audio quality, and 2, you can get backup audio, whether that's using the internal microphone from Canon or using the electronic hot shoe microphone from Canon and some sort of wireless lav to the microphone jack, on the camera body. So this one's going to be a tie. So if we add up all the points that I gathered for each camera, the Canon R1 pulls ahead with 17 points and the Canon R5 Mark II is behind with 9 points. But that really doesn't mean much, so what is my final verdict and conclusion? For starters, the Canon R1 is definitely more reliable, has less overheating risk, a much sharper 4K 60, amazing low light performance, great battery life, is super durable and rugged, and has amazing customization. So I think the Canon R1 is great if any of those things are really important to your workflow. You're definitely not going to be disappointed if you go with the Canon R1. I think it's best suited for those who work in documentary or any sort of shoot where you don't have control over the lighting because of how well this camera can perform in low light conditions. It's also great for long form video due to its battery life and overheat performance. And of course, if 4K 60 is really important to your workflow and you want it to look sharp, then you'll definitely want to go with the Canon R1 over the R5 Mark II. But its biggest downfalls, of course, is that extra $2,000 you're going to cough up for the body alone, as well as the extra cost for batteries and those CF Express Type B cards. So what about the Canon R5 Mark II? I think its biggest strengths is that one, it's $2,000 cheaper than the Canon R1. It has access to higher resolution photos and video options. It's definitely a lot smaller and compact, but if you do want to upgrade it, you have a bunch of additional grips that you can buy for it. And the image quality is comparable when there is a lot of light available to the sensor. So I think the Canon R5 Mark II is best suited for those working in studio environments or environments where you have a lot of control over the lighting. And because it's a lot smaller and compact and a little more discreet, I think it makes a great run and gun camera. You also have access to much higher resolutions than the 6K sensor on the R1. So if you intend to shoot a lot of 8K content or even 4K raw content, then the R5 Mark II is fantastic. Unfortunately, the 4K video performance is going to cap out at 30 frames per second, at least as of right now. I'm really hoping that Canon releases an update that allows us to oversample in 4K 60, but alas, that's not available as of right now. And then the two biggest drawbacks are its low light performance isn't very good. It's definitely a lot more sensitive to overheating unless you get the cooling fan grip, but even with the grip, it doesn't quite perform as well as the Canon R1. And then its 4K 60 is currently soft, and if you're shooting a lot of 4K 60 content, you may want to look for a different camera. But what do you think? Would you go for the Canon R1 as a filmmaker or the Canon R5 Mark II? If you liked this comparison video, then check out this comparison between the Canon R1 and the Canon R6 Mark II. Thank you so much for watching all the way until the end. I appreciate every single one of you who do, and I'll see you in that next video. Peace.